Buenos and Hafide. My name is Aveah Reyes, and today I'll be presenting to you an interactive lesson on the Chamorro Language of Guam, written by William Safford in 1905. So, first we have the agenda. We have 6 items. The first one is the author background, and then from there I'll be going on to the contents of the Chamorro Language of Guam. First is the introduction. Second is the orthography or correct pronunciation. Third is the article. Fourth is the noun. Fifth and finally is the pronoun. And then after that, I'll be going into my conclusion as well as my creative piece. So the first item on our list is author background. So again, the author of the Chamorro Language of Guam is William Safford, born in 1859 and died in 1926. So Safford was born in Ohio and arrived to the island of Guam in August 1899. With 22 years of service in the Navy under his belt, he served as an aide to the first American naval governor. So this time, 1899, was right after the Spanish-American War, and it was when the American government was trying to establish a governance here in Guam. So he was an aide again to the first American naval governor, Captain Richard P. Laurie, where then he became known as the first lieutenant governor of Guam. But before he arrived to Guam in his early life, he was raised in a community that was predominantly German, even attending a German school. He also entered the Naval Academy in 1876, where he could speak 2 languages fluently. One, as you would guess, is German, what he grew up with, and then later on it would be Spanish. However, as a student, he was regarded as studious and kind-hearted. So originally he was raised to be Episcopalian, which is Anglican. However, Safford at age 16 was confirmed in the Roman Catholic Church, but he soon abandoned his Catholic faith because he didn't agree with the entire dogma, with all of the teachings of the church. However, his brief time in the Catholic faith did give him a sympathetic understanding of the natives of Guam. But apart from his spiritual life, he was also noted for his linguistic talent, being fluent in Spanish as well as German, and of course, being able to speak Spanish, he became familiar with the natives of Guam, with those who spoke it. So, because of his background, having spent a brief time in Catholicism and also having linguistic talent, both came to serve him well during his administration here in Guam. Now, moving on to his administrative work on Guam, when Safford inherited what one source called Guam an unprofitable responsibility, he lived above the public treasury in Hagåtña, which was previously occupied by Jose Rodriguez Sixto. But there, he faced challenges in Guam's political structure, but then he also faced problems in areas such as land ownership, food supply, public health, and education. However, he addressed these problems many times through general orders, one being where he taxed people on land, but being able to tax people on land also helped locals establish land titles, which is very helpful during that time. Another general order was establishing a free public education system, and you do see that today in GDOE, the Guam Department of Education. But then in 1900, he was relieved of his duties, so it was a very short time, or a short administration, because again, he came to Guam in 1899, and then was relieved of his duties in the 1900s. So again, very brief administration that he had. But nonetheless, many Chamorros were grateful or expressed gratitude for what he did, especially when he established land titles for local farmers and people. When he had that general order of taxing, he was able to again establish land titles for locals. And although not all the issues were resolved during his administration, again because it was very short, but although he wasn't able to resolve everything, he laid important foundation. He laid the groundwork for future governors to build or establish an American system of government on Guam. Sorry about that. And then finally, you have written works. When he retired in 1900, Safford assumed the position of an economic botanist in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I don't know if I pronounced that right. But anyway, and what his position was is that he studied plants. I believe it's a position where he studied plants. But anyway, his research helped him compose several other works. One is the Chamorro Language of the Island of Guam, 1905, which I'll be talking about just in a few seconds, and then also the useful plants of the island of Guam in the same year, 1905. However, in 1924, he suffered a paralytic stroke, and he continued his work, but then he passed away in 1926. And that is the background of William Edwin Safford. Now you can go ahead and answer this quick question. So thank you for answering your first quiz question. Now I have to ask you to answer your first critical thinking question, which is, do you believe Safford's background may have also played a role in composing his work, The Chamorro Language of Guam, in 1905? Why or why not? So a hint I can give you is just think about his, when I talked about him being a Catholic and also him being able to speak multiple languages, Spanish and German, and also, of course, his position in Guam, his being a critical figure in Guam society when he was the first lieutenant of Guam. Those are things you can think about when answering this question. Good luck. So thank you for answering your first critical thinking question. Now I'll be going on to the work itself, which is, again, the Chamorro Language of Guam, 1905. So first, I'll be talking about his introduction. So, Safford, in his introduction, does two things. One, he explores the scope of his work. Second, he introduces his sources. So, first, I'll be talking about his scope or the purpose of his work. So, Safford does not want his work to be portrayed as an analysis of the Chamorro language, nor does he want it to be the language of the people or vernacular of the Chamorro people. Instead, his work seeks to serve students of comparative philology, especially those who express an interest in Malayan and Philippine language groups, as well as an interest in the language of the Pacific. He also wants to make it obvious. He wants to make Chamorro distinct from being just a Micronesian dialect. He wants to show that the Chamorro language is a language of its own. It's not a Micronesian dialect. Now, second, like I said, he names his sources. So he credits several individuals. One, he talks about the short vocabularies of the Chamorro language he used, which were from men of science, those who were on exploration. So first you have Chamiso, where in 1817 he visited Guam with Kotzebue, I believe, Kotzebue. And then second, you have Gaymard in 1819, where he was aboard the Uvain in company of Facing It. And then moving on, you have his second source, which is a small dictionary in little work by Faye Carman. Faye Carman, what his source is that he explains the Christian doctrine, as well as the creed, prayers in Spanish and Chamorro, which provide insight to Safford about the Chamorro language structure. However, Faye Carman does not make any remarks on the island vernacular, not Carmen, but Safford. He makes no remarks on the island vernacular or about Chamorro Spanish words. So that's again Faye Carman. Now finally, you have the manuscript notes by Father Jose Palomo, translated by Don Juan D. Torres. So in his introduction, Safford really credits Father Palomo and is grateful for Father Palomo putting aside time for Safford and learning about the Chamorro language. But both Father Palomo and the translator Don Torres were highly praised in his introduction because of them being descendants of Don Luis de Torres, who was an intelligent and well-educated native praised by Chamiso and others as being the chief of their information on natives. One person, I believe it's Safford, quote-unquote, says, "I remember him with warm affection and sincere gratitude, opened to me the treasures of his knowledge, and spoke to his people most lovingly." So again, this is Father Jose Palomo as well as Don Juan D. Torres. And that is his introduction. Now I have to ask you to answer your critical thinking question 2, which is, Safford credits several individuals at the beginning of his work. Why does Safford choose to do this in the beginning rather than at the end? And your hint is, think about the scope of his work, his purpose. So we're still in the introduction, but in the introduction I do want to talk about something else, which is the history of the language. Not only does Safford talk about his scope and names his sources, but he does dive into Micronesia and what it is, so I would also like to talk about that. So, history of language. Among the vocabulary Safford studied, there are a handful of discrepancies due to the different systems of orthography or spelling used. This is emphasized when you would compare earlier Spanish vocabularies, as there are changes in the pronunciation of words, as well as changes in the terminal of U to O. This is because the Spanish often had the habit of avoiding hard terminal consonant sounds, which led to that change, like I said, from U to O. Another example of discrepancies in vocabulary is, like I said, spelling, such as in the names of places on Guam. For example, you have Maleso, but then you'd have the name Maritzo. Maleso is the Chamorro name, Maritzo is the Spanish. So you see that there is some discrepancies. Now, Safford also talks about the geography of the Chamorro language, where he starts first with talking about the Marian, the Marian Islands, or also known as the Marianas or Ladrones, is an archipelago of small volcanic islands that forms a chain that is 400 miles long, and then together with Carolines, Marshall, and Gilbert groups, you have the Marianas making up what's called the Micronesia. Yeah, Micronesia. And Guam is considered the most significant of Micronesia, being the only island that is a property of the U.S., where we are U.S. territory. And this is compared to others who were sold to Germany. So, like I said, the Mariana Islands were first discovered by Magellan in March 6, 1521, but the first European settlement was by Spaniards in 1898 by Padre Diego Luis de San Vitores. So now natives of the Mariana Islands are called Chamorros, and they speak the Chamorro language. That's their vernacular. And Chamorro comes with the word Chamorri, or Chamoli, I believe Chamoli, meaning chief. And the vernacular is called sorry if I mispronounce, Fino Haza, which means idiom of the South. This is different from the Spanish, which called the Chamorro language Finologu, idiom of the North. And the reason why there's a discrepancy is because that's the direction the Spanish, I believe, discovered Guam from the north. So that's why they called the language Finologu. But again, for us Chamorros, we call it Fino Haza. So yeah, Fino Haza. Moving on. So more about the history of the language. There were assumptions of the Chamorro people and their language. One was that the Chamorro people were non-existent, having been wiped out by the Spaniards in the 17th century. In fact, in the classification of the Indo-Pacific races of man, the Marianas are not mentioned. And then second assumption was that the present inhabitants of Micronesia are Spanish-speaking, which characterized Chamorro as just a dialect of the region, being closely related to Tagalog. However, in his work, Safford disregards this notion. He makes it clear that Chamorro is a distinct language and not just a Micronesian, but is not a Micronesian dialect. It has its own unique vocabulary and contains features that are similar to other groups, which is why it's part of the Austronesian language family. How the features that make it similar to other groups is its possessive suffixes, infixes, prefixes and suffixes, and reduplication of syllables. However, he does acknowledge that pure-blooded Chamorros are no longer found on Guam because we're just such a diverse island. However, he does say that the Chamorro language is still a medium of communication among native families, and this is heavily due to mothers teaching their children our native tongue, the Chamorro language. So the takeaway from this section would be that the Chamorro language, the modern vernacular, has been modified heavily by Spanish influence, where we adopt many Spanish words. However, modern Chamorro still conforms words of Spanish to its grammatical rules, meaning that although we borrow Spanish words, the Spanish words still have to follow our grammar rules and structure. So now, having talked about the history of our language, you can go ahead and answer critical thinking question number 3, which is, Chamorro assimilated the Spanish language with their own, but also made Spanish words follow its own grammar rules. How does this simple action reflect cultural resilience or challenge former assumptions of the Chamorro people? Your hint, Safford asserts Chamorro as a distinct language. Now, done with the introduction, now we're going into the more fun stuff where we actually talk about the Chamorro language. First, we'll be going over the authority, or the correct pronunciation. Now, I know my pronunciation is not very clear, so many times I'm going to be referring to the recordings of fluent Chamorro speakers, one of them being my previous professor, Cody Lazama, who was my Chamorro language teacher. So I'll be inserting some recordings of him pronouncing, especially like the alphabet and vowels, so that you'll have, the correct pronunciation of it. Anyway, Orthography is again pronunciation, and about orthography is that pronouncing vowels in the Chamorro language very much resembles vowels in the Italian or German language. So first, you talk about the alphabet. So you have basically the same thing as the English alphabet, but you do have extras like lota, and then of course the sounds are different. So here you can go ahead and listen to how you pronounce the alphabets by my professor Cody Lozama.
So it goes like this: Lota, be, se. Notice how I just said se with the, almost my teeth touching each other and air coming out. And it's okay. Then there's e, not e, not e, but it's e. Fe, ge, he, e, get I, it's e. Ke, le, me, ne, nye, nye. Some people, so try to get that one right. Nye, nye, nye. Again, if you're having trouble with that one, what I would try to do is think of the word song, then get rid of the SO. So, na, 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 nye, nye. Maulik? Okay. Then we have the word o, pe, re, se, te. Careful with this one because some people might add the English T. It's not English T sound. It's te, not te. Okay? Not a te. U. Last one. Ze, ze, ze.
Now we'll be going on to second vowels. You can go ahead and listen to again my professor.
I have them right here. Glota, a, e, o, u, I.
So those are how the vowels sound. Thank you again, Professor Cody Lozama. Now, some rules on vowels is that a vowel may be long, short, or guttural. Long, meaning that it's not usually marked, but sometimes can be indicated by a macron, a slash on top of the letter. Short is indicated by a breve, which is a kind of a KV line on top of the letter. And then guttural is basically a sound from like you're sounding from your throat, and it's indicated by a circumflex accent. So these are examples of long, short, and guttural vowels. Anyway, over the years there has been much confusion and modification on vowels in the Chamorro language. Confusion such as between using E or I or E or I or U or O. However, the general rule is that when the article is possessive, we use I and U. For modification on vowels, certain words and particles may modify vowels. So, like for example, a O becomes E or U becomes I. This is what later I'll be talking about is known as gumabet. Now, I won't talk about it right now, but just know that modification is known as gumabet, house of vowels. Anyway, this modifications between using gumabet and using I and U instead of E or O is a cause for many discrepancies, as I mentioned before, in vocabularies, especially from early navigators who were Spanish and European origin. However, because of this confusion, this rule came about that the letter K should always be used and G should always be hard. Now, moving on to diphthongs and consonants. So, diphthongs first is that they are two vowels put together, as you can see from the list below, and then consonants, just like diphthongs, have parallels between the Spanish and German language, especially in their sounds. Now moving on to syllables. So syllables may be open or closed, and for the Chamorro vernacular, closed syllables are significant as well as final consonants. An example of an open and closed syllable is tata, meaning father. Then lastly, you have accents. So Chamorros normally place stress on the second to last syllable. However, when it's two syllables, the accent is on the first. And then if it's more than two syllables, the accent may vary. You hear a lot of differences with Chamorro speakers. However, if the accent does not fall on the second to last syllable, an acute accent should be above where the emphasis falls on. However, also with root words, the accent shifts due to an addition particles in the word. So moving on to critical thinking, question 4. Why do you believe it is important to learn and understand the orthography of any language? Should the orthography of the Chamorro language be taught in school curriculums? Why or why not? So a hint for you is that again, orthography is defined as the correct pronunciation of words or standard pronunciation of a language. Now moving on to the article section. So Chamorro uses specific articles based on whether the noun is definite, indefinite, or proper. First, you have indefinite article, which is basically in English. So originally there was no definite article in Chamorro, but the modern vernacular, modern Chamorro, follows the Spanish particle on that can be used with masculine and feminine nouns. However, sometimes it's not really necessary. For example of the indefinite article would be like Palawan, a woman. Next, you have indefinite article, which is e or I, and it's the in English. So the definite article is usually placed before the noun, but it is the article that triggers the vowel modification rule, where it changes the vowel of the stress syllable. If you recall when I talked about it in the authority section, when I mentioned a concept called gumabet, how we sometimes change the O to E or U to I, this is the same thing. When you change the vowel of the stress syllable, it's called gumabet, and it's only triggered when you have a definite article E in front of the noun. And in the picture, you'll see examples. For example, you have pota, but when you have the definite article E, it becomes ipeta. O changes to E. Now moving on to proper nouns. So the Chamorro vernacular employs specific articles for proper nouns. So, for example, we have the article si, which is used for titles of persons and animals. Then you have as, which is used for names of places and natural objects, and also when the subject is at the end. Then you have isa, which is used for saint names or names that have no known significance. But sometimes the isa can become giza when it's in its prepositional form. Sometimes the article may be omitted. So for is omission. This is if the place name is preceded or followed by balag or gini, meaning go to or from. Then if you have any of those words, you don't need to include an article if it has those two things, meaning go to and from. So halfway there, we're going on to the noun. So Chamorro nouns are characterized by really three things and also a complex system of derivations or derivatives. And this is often through and for the derivation or derivatives, that's often through particles. But for now, we're going to focus on the three things that Chamorro nouns can be characterized by. So first, you have gender. Gender can be broken down into 4 distinct groups: male, female, common, and neuter gender. Male and female, self-explanatory. Common is when the sex is unidentified, and neuter gender is when you're talking about inanimate objects. And oftentimes, the prefix may be a good indicator of what gender it is. For example, with male and female, Lahi is male and Palawan is female. And then below is also a list of other gender nouns that you can go ahead and take a look at. But for now, we're just going to move on to the second characterization of nouns, which is number. So number in Chamorro has a singular, dual, or plural form. Singular is one person, but for dual, it's mainly just 2 people. So for dual, it's a separate form of a noun that is based upon a mutual or reciprocal relationship. And it uses the particle before the first vowel of the primitive word. And like I said, it expresses a mutual or reciprocal relationship. Like, for example, with a spouse, with the particle it'll become asagwa. Asagwa. And then, a noun can also be plural, meaning more than 2 people. And plural nouns uses siha, which is usually followed by the noun. However, sometimes the adjective can already express its plurality, already express it being plural, so you don't need to use siha. An example of a plural form using siha is with ccc is with a knife, ccsiha, meaning knives. Other rules of the plural noun is that sometimes the noun may have a plural form of its own, where it has a prefix man. It already shows the names of persons and of occupations whom the noun is engaging with. So again, some may have its own plural form, which is usually with the prefix man. For example, manetlu, meaning brothers or sisters. That is on its plural form of its own plural form, because it has the prefix man, manelo, brothers, sisters. And then you also have irregular plurals. Irregular plurals are very few of them, but some of them do reduplicate the first syllable, use prefixes, or even uses the particle ha. For example, with reduplication, you have lalahi, meaning men, or even using the particle ha. Hahaga. Sorry, my pronunciation. Hahagahu, meaning my daughters. Hahagahu. Now moving on to another characterization, which is case. So a form of a noun does not vary to indicate case. However, naming an object as possessive, usually n is followed if it ends in a vowel. So for example, you have itaten, meaning the father. And so again, with case, the form of the noun does not generally change, but when it comes to it indicate possessiveness, if the noun ends in a vowel, the vowel is usually preceded by an n at the end, like with itaten. A is a vowel, so to indicate case, you'll just add an n, where it becomes itaten. Now going on to the complex system of derivatives, or derivation. In other dialects like Polynesian, a word can become several parts of speeches. Like one word can be an adjective, noun, and verb. However, Chamorro deviates from that normalcy, as a word can be combined with certain particles, prefixes, or suffixes instead. It may not be obvious when you to see these differences, all these particles, prefix, and suffix, but when you remove it, you'll be able to see the difference. And there are generally 5 ways that the noun can become a derivative. So the first one is just with a particle, with the particle n. The particle n is usually inserted before the first vowel, and this particle n is what forms abstract nouns from adjectives, verbs, or adverbs. And it also triggers the vowel modification rule, the gumabet. So again, for particle in, you form abstract nouns, side nouns, from adjectives, verbs, and adverbs, and you also apply the concept gumabet, where you change the vowel of the stressed syllable. Then second, you have reduplication. This is where you would duplicate the first syllable. And what this does is that it forms verbal nouns that designates an action or occupation. And for reduplication, the vowel of the prefix must be long, never guttural, and has to be open. And then the third one, you can use prefixes, ga and gi. Ga is usually for nouns and verbs, which indicates a fondness, taste, or tendency to a particular thing or action. Gi usually is for a geographical name, which signifies an inhabitant, native, or citizen of a certain place. And then the next one is particles, not in, but instead fan followed by zan. So a word that contains fan is usually followed by zan or an, and what these particles does is that it signifies a place devoted to a particular thing or that is in a certain state or condition. And then lastly, you have the suffix ha, which is apprehended or attached to a noun and pronoun, signifying the noun to be alone, real, or pure, or even meaning of no one else or nothing else. So in this next slide I provide examples of the article and the noun sections that I covered because it is a lot of information, and I believe an example will really help bring together everything and help you guys, and of course me, understand more about the noun and article because they're very important in the Chamorro grammar and sentence structure. However, because of the length of this video, I'm just gonna show the slide here, and then you can go ahead and look on the slide on your own and try and practice these examples yourself. And of course, you can also go to the article to see more examples, but I hope these examples help. So now we're moving on to the final section of the Chamorro language of Guam, the pronoun. So Chamorro pronouns share an origin with Malayan and Polynesian language, even with Melanesian and Philippine languages. However, one thing that sets the Chamorro language apart, particularly from the Polynesian and Philippine language, is that there is no dual form of a pronoun. Instead, you have personal pronouns, and the most distinctive feature of the personal pronouns, even though they have no dual form, is that for first person plural, if you look at the chart on the left, you have first person, second person, third person, and then you have singular and plural. If you look at the first person plural form of personal pronouns, you'll see hit with in, inclusive, ham with ex, exclusive. So hit, inclusive, basically says whether, or even the hit and ham, they both basically indicate whether you're including the person you're addressing or you're excluding the person you're addressing. The person addressing means the person you're talking to. Hit, you're including them. Have, you're excluding them. Hit, again, you and I, including you. Have, I'm excluding you. Only they and I. You also have case forms, modification of personal pronouns, and there are two of them. The first form is when the pronoun stands alone, follows a preposition, or is emphasized before the predicate. For example, you have at our house, Giza having. And then the second form is used, or is when the predicate / object is the main idea, and the pronoun comes after it. For example, you have I am a man. It's lahi zo. Similarly, the second and third person plural forms of the personal pronouns, there is only one form of them, regardless of whether the pronoun comes before or after the verb. So those are your personal pronouns. Now we have second demonstrative pronouns. This is the this and that in English. So like yahi, and now, inni, yana. Please excuse me if I'm pronouncing them wrong. And then third, you have indefinite interrogative pronouns. This is for example, in English, it's like somebody, whomsoever, who, what. In Chamorro, it's like why, guaha, hazi, hafa. So those are some examples of those pronouns: guaha, hazi, hafa. And then finally, 4, you have relative pronouns. So sometimes relative pronouns are not regarded as pronouns. They are regarded differently from pronouns, but they do use I, ni, and na. I and ni are for specific pronouns, and na is for non-specific pronouns, if you just to dumb it down. But according to the source, I is a definite relative and is used if the antecedent is a demonstrative pronoun or is limited by demonstrative adjective. For example, you have Siwan, Yahi, I, Pomono, Igahu, Babri, which is John is the one who killed my pig. You see the article. You see the pronoun I, and Yahi I Pomono, Pumunu, there, Pumunu. And then you have not I, which is used when an antecedent is preceded by the definite article I. So, Mafanaten, Jose Palomo, I Poli, Ni I, Fimanagui, Zo. And then in English, it's named Jose Palomo, the priest who taught me. You see Ni'i, which is Pali Ni'i, Famanagui. And then na is again for non-specific nouns. But according to the work, it's sometimes indefinite and it's used with descriptive subordinate clauses when the antecedent is not modified by demonstrative adjective nor the definite article I. So, an example. Okay, let me try. Huli, Huli Tau, na Paroha, Lamazo. I saw a person who did nothing but boast. You see na with Tau na Paroha. Tau na Paroha. So just to close it off, like English, the relative pronoun is sometimes omitted. It really depends on the Chamorro speaker. However, a sentence involving an independent and dependent clause is preferred by Chamorro speakers to be a compound sentence, which is usually connected with the conjunction za, meaning and. So now to your final critical thinking question. Critical thinking question number 5. So after learning some basics and rules of the Chamorro language, like its grammar and structure, what do you think would be the hardest or easiest to apply when speaking and forming sentences in Chamorro? So like for example, for me, I made it really obvious that the pronunciation or authority is the one that would be the hardest for me to apply, because my pronunciation is not that strong yet. It's not that at that level yet where I can really, fully teach you guys and, show you how to correctly pronounce the words. So for example, that for me would be the hardest part to apply. So go ahead and answer and just think of the sections we went over. Which one would be hardest? Which one would be easiest? So now ending off with my conclusion. So again, the Chamorro Language of Guam was written by William Safford in 1905, where he describes the Chamorro language spoken and how it works by its sound, grammar, and vocabulary, and how it has changed over time. He explains his scope and how he got sources from individuals, especially Father Palomo. And even though Guam has ruled over Spain for over 200 years, his work and the fact that there's still a lot of authentic Chamorro in our vernacular shows that the core of our language still remains strong today. And he also shares how the language is used in everyday life by providing examples and why it's important to protect and understand our language because it is unique. It is a distinct language, not a Micronesian dialect. And so key takeaways: one, Chamorro is deeply rooted in the Austronesian language family, having similar origins with Polynesian, Philippine. And then second, language reflects cultural resilience and everyday life. Because Sanford shows how Chamorro language is used in naming, storytelling, and social customs, he not only captures the grammar and structure of Chamorro sentences, but the lived experiences and values of Chamorro society, because he shows how important it is to preserve our language for future generations. And so also what I want to include in my conclusion is my creative piece, which is Estina Chamorro. It's basically a Chamorro song written by Casey Leon Guerrero. I think Casey Leon Guerrero. And I wanted to include it because it basically summarizes what I talked about. He includes many of the grammar structure and rules, such as the articles, like when he uses C, like C Thomas, C Mike, C Antonio, and you'll see a lot of articles like E, and then even pronouns so. So it's not only one of my favorite songs, Chamorro songs, but it is a great real life example of many of the concepts that we learned. And of course, listening to it in a song will maybe help you understand how to form sentences and speak Chamorro. And of course, reinforce the concepts that I talked about. So thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.